Teachers, what's the darkest thing you've seen from a student? Not a teacher. But I worked with students. A student was forced to give oral sex in a vehicle while a screwdriver was held to her neck. When he orgasmed, she made a run for it back to her residence. She had the clarity and ingenuity to keep the semen in her mouth and spit it in a cup for evidence. There was a manhunt and the guy was caught. He was convicted of 3 separate student assaults across the state. I was in the emergency room with the student a couple hours after the incident. Standing there as she described what happened. Through her tears and in front of her mother. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to witness. A student during holiday break a few years back murdered her mother and her mother's boyfriend brutally with the help of her own boyfriend. Then the bodies laid in the apartment as she left and eventually went to a New Year's party days later. Eventually she was arrested along with her boyfriend. Chilling to think she was sitting in my classroom days before. Probably with this whole plan in her head. I was student teaching when I was 21. I had a class of high school seniors. One boy was caught telling his friend he planned to pay me in my car. I ended up getting transferred about 2 months into my student teaching experience. I've been assaulted before. So it felt even worse. Edit. I'm really blown away by the kind replies here. Thank you all. Had a student in my class as a sophomore. Every morning her junior year she would come in and chat in the morning. One day out of the blue it stopped. In fact, she wasn't at school at all anymore. Fast forward 3 months. She shows up and looks broken. I ask her what's going on. After quite a bit of hesitation, she tells me that she went to a party and was DD. No alcohol in her system. However, she woke up the next morning and couldn't remember a thing about the previous night. A couple weeks later, she finds out she is pregnant. She was a virgin before that night. Roofied and raped. She had only told her counselor and now me. I haven't had a chance to talk to her due to COVID. Her outlook and demeanor was night and day before and after that party. Not my class, but I adopted a rabbit once to keep my other rabbit company. I noticed she didn't have a tail. And when I asked about it I was told she was a kindergarten pet. Apparently the reason she was up for adoption was that one of the children cut off her tail with a pair of FCKing safety scissors. She had some issues. I didn't see it. But I heard it. I used to work at a shelter for at-risk girls aged 8-18. Mainly truancy or runaway cases, but some were taken from homes of abuse, drugs, sex trafficking, etc. We housed and looked after roughly 20 girls at a time when we were at full capacity. Many of them had a lot of mental and emotional issues. One of our youngest girls at the time, around age 9, was talking to an older girl, around 13. Teen was nonchalantly talking about how she was our pet as a young girl before she came to the shelter. Next thing I knew, at least 10 other girls who had overheard the conversation started talking about how old they were when they were raped. Some rattled off multiple ages and times when it occurred. Just causally. It was chilling to hear so many young girls tell their tales. 13-year-old crying hysterically in class. Saying random adult voices are telling him to kill himself. Next day has no memory of incident. But tells me it comes in waves. Had a kindergartner smash a glass measuring cup and stab himself in the arm to the point that blood was everywhere. All while repeatedly crying, please just let me die. I just want to die. Had to sit in my car and cry for about 30 minutes before driving home that day. My mom was a school nurse and always came home with some crazy stories. One of the most blood-curdling things she has was a girl that was really into cutting to the point where she had a scar that covered the majority of the outside of her bicep. The girl one day decided that she hated her scar and wanted to get rid of it. At home. By herself. She decided she was going to get rid of them. In her bathroom. She took a knife to her arm. Cutting a 4x6 piece of scar tissue that was just under an inch thick out of her arm. She then proceeded to stitch it up using a needle and thread and bandage it with gauze all by herself. She then woke up and went to school the next day so she could go to my mom's office and ask if it looked infected. It was. Not a teacher, but I did do a lot of volunteer work with little kids. One of the 5th grade boys was caught grabbing random girls and trying to pull them into the supply closet and try to kiss them. He was even caught trying to grab their butts or without his hand on their seat as they started to sit down. When we finally got to talk to his parents, turned out his grandpa was teaching him these things. The weirdest part was when we questioned the grandpa about it, his response was, "Who cares? They're just little girls. Grandpa's a piece of shit." I'm a teacher. A student saw one of my former co-teachers at some point with his wife and thought she was hot. And my co-teacher took advantage of this to get the student to secretly record his sister taking showers and shit. He offered videos of his wife performing sexual acts on with him to the student in exchange. He finally got caught when the student blackmailed the teacher into trying to get the wife to FCK him. And when he proposed it to his wife, she called the cops. I taught welding and metal sculpture at the high school level for a year. One morning, one of my students, a quiet, awkward, but really nice young man, came into class and asked me for a band-aid. I asked him what for and he replied that it was for a burn. Class hadn't started yet for the day. He showed me and it was a fresh 2nd-degree burn that was already blistering. It was in the shape of an A. Some kids, if I'm going to be honest, they were bottom performers and troublemakers, from a different class of mine, had swiped a small metal letter A from one of my supply bins, heated it with a lighter, and then branded this kid on the morning school bus. He had let the kids do it because he really wanted to fit in. He didn't have many friends and these kids had seemed cool because they were always acting out. As a mandatory reporter, I reported it. The police got involved. Other than that, I have no idea what else happened. In elementary school we had a kid with a severe peanut allergy and a teacher caught some kids rubbing peanut butter on the opening of his water bottle. We also had a kid who could describe in detail about how to prepare heroin. For some reason the peanut butter story bothered me more than the little heroin chemist. I had a kid who really wanted his parents to come to his graduation ceremony, but they were both sex offenders and couldn't be on campus. He just wanted someone there to support him. My first year teaching was, like everyone says, the worst year. The first day of school I'm getting to know the kids by asking them random questions, and I ask this one boy what he wants to be when he grows up and he replies with, "Doesn't matter, I'm going to end up in prison like my parents." Whoa, okay. From there things got progressively worse. He was hearing voices and always threatening to hurt other staff or students. He was hitting his head on walls or windows when frustrated. He came back from spring break and told me the voices told him to kill a cat he found. By the end of the year he was sexually assaulting girls at school. When I was a student teacher, I taught briefly at a school with very old school approach to teaching. Desks in rows. Nothing is shared. No group collaboration. Students don't engage, only listen. The demographic that went to this school took their children's education very seriously. And students had very strict parents. On one of the first days meeting my class of grade 3 students, I had the students wash their hands before doing an activity. I was helping some students roll up their sleeves while they were washing. I got to the last student, and my mentor teacher tells me to stop, which caught me by surprise. She pulled me over and told me that particular student had cuts and bruises all the way up his arm from alleged domestic abuse. The relevant government agencies were already involved in the case. She noticed it when she realized he always flinched when she came near his arms. The fact that he never gave high fives, or that he only ever wore long sleeve shirts to school. It was one of those sobering moments where you realize there is still evil in this world. The teacher next to me in one portable classroom arrived to find a used condom tied to the doorknob. They did catch the kid that placed it there. It shocked everyone. In my anatomy class I had a kid grab a scalpel and just about try to kill himself in front of me. Had to grab the scalpel and talk him down. He had been suicidal all year. Hope he's okay now. When I was in JR Hi, I was self-harming under my desk with a pencil sharpener. My teacher walked to my desk and discreetly put his hand out. I put it in his hand and he walked away. I still remember that. I wish I could go back and thank him for it. I've got two. I had a student casually tell me about how he pulled the eyes out of his rabbit's head. He explained how there was blood everywhere. This was my first day working as a supply teacher at that school, and my first conversation with the student. I later brought it up to support staff and they were shocked he mentioned it to me. Apparently he killed his rabbit because his mom loved it more than she loved him. The boy was now in foster care, as his mother was a drug addict. He shared a lot of really dark stuff with me that day. Another one, more sad than dark, was at a different school. Students had to write their address for an assignment, but this 4th grade girl didn't know hers. Another student asked me, "Do you know where the so and so motel is? She lives there." Really broke my heart, as this girl was so young and innocent, and didn't really understand how unfortunate her living situation was as she proudly googled the motel and found her address. Really low income part of town. A former student of mine was always the quiet one in class. Taught them for 4 years and I spent a large amount of time trying to get them to open up and contribute to class as their written work was exceptional. 7 years after graduation they emailed to apologize for being quiet and that they didn't want me to think they were stuck up. They were being frequently upset by a family member the whole time and were too afraid to speak out. Absolutely broke me. Our school had a selective mute kid that graduated last year. Kids were calling him Fish Boy. It turns out he was buying fish and killing them in various ways on Instagram based on people's requests in the comments. Edit. Was not expecting to be the top comment and didn't realize I haven't been on Reddit in 3 days. He was not a student of mine so I can't really elaborate. All I remember is the school found out because he brought a fish to school. Edit again. I teach middle school and I'm surprised how much selective mutism is a thing. We have 3 selective mutes this year. Saw a couple of kids walking down the hallway. One ends up behind another. For no reason at all punches him in the head as hard as he can. I immediately call him over and ask why the crap he did it. He immediately acts like he has no idea what I'm talking about. If I hadn't seen him do it I'd probably have believed it, he was so convincing. I remind him there are cameras and then he admits he did it just because he wanted to. No remorse. No reason. No regret. I had multiple other incidents like that with him through the year. I worked in a low-income high-needs school then and tried my best not to judge my students, but it was weird to honestly believe this 14-year-old was going to seriously injure or kill someone one day. Darkest thing. I was an intervention specialist. Had a student who was a mysterious pooper. For a while he would poop on the floor in the bathroom and no one knew who was doing it. I'm not a teacher, but in junior high we had a special ed kid and everyone got along with him. And the 2 troublemakers we had gave him a knife and told him to hurt himself with it. They got suspended or expelled. A list simply entitled "The List" with a few students' names and my co-teacher's name on it. Was a student with some serious behavioral disabilities on it who admitted it was a kill list. Edit. RIP my inbox. Lots of people on here who experienced something similar. No, this was not recent. The student received appropriate support after this incident. Well, hey. I actually had a year where kids were doing personal narratives and sharing them with the class. They knew in advance of choosing their story that they'd be sharing with the class. One kid told the story of her dad killing her mom and then himself, which he woke up to on Christmas morning. Another talked about defending her brother in court for beating her dad within an inch of his life when he found out dad was sexually abusing her. The next told about fleeing the cartels after his dad killed one of them to protect him and seeking asylum in America. Let me tell you, kids have seen some shitty as a light at the end of the tunnel. After like 5 of these kinds of stories in a row, I asked if anyone had a happy story to break all the sadness. This bright-eyed kid popped right up and told about his dog having puppies. and offering them to the traumatized kids. There was kid in my wife's class that squeezed the classroom hamster to death. He just wanted to tend the rabbits. Not a teacher. But when I was in high school my senior year, a guy in my English class asked me out. I wasn't into him, but I didn't want to hurt his feelings, so I said that I wasn't really looking to date anyone. Every day for the rest of the semester he sat behind me in class and would describe in vivid detail the ways he was going to murder me. One example of this was him cutting my legs off and dragging me behind his car. Someone told me that he waited for me to leave school one day. But I always stayed several hours late at school for speech and debate practice and theater rehearsal. My grandfather was a band director. I was taking a trumpet lesson with him after school, when another teacher walked in and handed my grandfather a suicide note he found from a student I didn't really know. My grandfather left and I went home. And after talking to him later, he talked with the student and the counselor, and eventually they got him the help he needed. Not a teacher, but in my 5th grade class this autistic kid that had a crush on this girl decided to make his move. They sat on the same table in English. So the autistic kid stands up on top of the table and takes his pants down and shakes his ass for not only the girl, but for everyone in the whole classroom to see. When we were 12, a classmate of mine was obsessed with another girl. He would brag about his plan to drag her into the boys' bathroom and pay her. As kids, we didn't know what that truly meant or what to do about it. I remember talking about it at recess. Teachers eventually got involved, and nothing ever happened. Thank God. I'm not a teacher, but in middle school some classmates would do drugs during recess. These drugs ranged from cigarettes to weed to crystal meth right on the playground. This is in South Central LA, and I never realized how bad it was until I grew up and moved to a richer area in Orange County. Also, pregnant 6th and 7th graders, kids in and out of juvie, middle school drug dealers, etc. Pregnant 6th and 7th graders. I teach an algebra class and I was explaining how, in our city at least, your address tells you how far you are from the central streets like a Cartesian coordinate system. A girl, who happens to be my daughter's friend, volunteered to let me graph her address. 3 months later a boy got expelled for threatening to shoot up the school. He had her address and written threats to kidnap her from her house. He got the address from that class. Answering questions from thread 1. I do not blame myself for the actions of crazy people. He could have found info several other ways. 2. I put my address up first and my daughter's friend wanted to use hers so that they could know the distance between their houses, was the point of the exercise. 3. Kid has 0% chance of kidnapping her. I know her family well. A student of mine was a constant troublemaker and wannabe thug. During a football game, he broke his arm and had it placed in a plaster cast. A few days later, he got into an argument with another student. At the end of the day, wannabe thug jumped the other kid and started pummeling his face with the cast. Wannabe was arrested and the other kid was hospitalized for almost a week with massive facial injuries, 2 black eyes, broken nose, multiple lost teeth, and multiple cuts to his face from the beating. Edit update. Most comments are stating the obvious, he doesn't sound like a wannabe thug based in this account. Rest assured. Until he went beast mode, he was a wannabe. His status obviously improved after this and after his time in juvie. But once his arm healed and his weapon was removed, his status quickly diminished as his buddies realized he was a one-hit wonder. I was teaching in a tiny community. 13-year-olds. This kid's uncle, also a teacher, pulled her aside and she started bawling. Says her teenage brother died in a skidoo accident. We find out a week later that he was basically almost murdered and left for dead by a gang of teenagers and bled to death. That place was all sorts of messed up. She turned out okay. Edit. 1. I'm not sure if mortally wounding was right. Kid could probably have recovered if he had medical attention. 2. It gets to like -40°C where I was. That's also minus 40 in freedom units. 3. If you call a ski-doo a snowmobile, you lose your cred in northern Canada. I thought about adding a disambiguation but decided against it. 4. I stopped teaching after that school year. Therapy helps.